It was the start of winter in Iowa, and instead of cozying up at home, two kids, Billy, 13, and Jimmy, 14, were crammed into a cold metal container hitched to a truck. Their destination was a place simply known as the camp. The truck wasn't carrying just them. 6 other boys were in there too, all nameless, all abandoned for reasons none of them understood. They didn't know each other, but one thing was clear: they all felt betrayed. To these kids, it seemed like their parents wanted them gone, shipping them off like old luggage they didn't need anymore. The reality, though, was a little different. Every one of those boys came from struggling families. Their parents had sent them away, not because they didn't care, but because they hoped the camp would feed and shelter their kids while they worked to get back on their feet. Still, for the boys, it was hard to see past the rejection. As the container rattled along, some kids quietly wondered what this camp might be like, while others lay curled up, trying to sleep. The sobbing had stopped hours ago, and most had accepted they wouldn't see home again until spring. 3 hours later, after what felt like forever, the truck screeched to a stop. The boys sat up, confused, as the container's hatch swung open. An older man with a gray mustache and a weathered face poked his head inside. "All right, boys. Time to get moving," he barked, his gruff voice cutting through the cold air. The kids clambered out, their feet crunching on the frosted leaves scattered across the ground. The man stood tall and motioned for their attention. "Name's Mr. Garrett," he said plainly, "and you better remember it. Now, we've got a bit of a walk ahead, so let's get moving." "Yes, sir," one of the boys mumbled, half-heartedly. Mr. Garrett shot him an approving nod, then started down a dirt path carved out of the woods. The boys shuffled after him, still dazed from the journey. For what felt like hours, they trudged through the wilderness. Leaves crumbled underfoot, and the air was crisp enough to sting their faces. Finally, the group emerged into a clearing, and there it was, Leafwood Camp. A worn wooden sign swung on rusty chains above the entrance, greeting them in silence. "Come on, boys," Mr. Garrett said, his voice weary now. "Let's get you settled." Inside the camp, the layout was simple but eerie. A dining hall, a few scattered cabins, and a game area were the main attractions. In the center of the clearing stood a tall wooden pole with a loudspeaker bolted to the top. Security cameras dotted the premises, though their placement seemed careless at best. Some pointed to the sky, others directly at the ground. "This is home for the next few months," Mr. Garrett said, his tone half cheerful, half grim. He led the boys to a cabin, opening the door with a creak. "This is where you'll sleep. Keep it clean, and don't break anything." The boys nodded, then scrambled to claim their bunks. Within half an hour, most were out cold, too tired to care about the rough mattresses or the drafty walls. Late that night, Johnny, a wiry boy with sharp features, woke suddenly. It was 2 in the morning, and sweat dripped from his forehead. He glanced around but saw no one else stirring. Quietly, he slipped out of his bunk and tiptoed outside to find the bathroom. The camp was nearly pitch black, save for a few dim lights scattered around. As Johnny crept across the clearing, something caught his eye. He froze. There, near the edge of the woods, a figure loomed. It was tall, at least 9 feet, and unnaturally thin. Its skin was pale, almost glowing, and its face was a nightmare. An elongated head with a grotesquely wide mouth and faint hints of a nose. It had no eyes, but Johnny felt it staring right at him. The creature raised a spindly hand to its mouth and stretched its lips into an unnatural smile, revealing jagged, pointed teeth. Then it opened its mouth wide and shrieked, a distorted, childlike sound that seemed to form one word. H-U-U-N-G-R-Y-Y-Y-Y. Johnny couldn't move. He was rooted to the spot, paralyzed with fear. Suddenly, a firm hand gripped his shoulder, yanking him back. "What are you doing out here, boy?" Mr. Garrett's voice hissed in his ear. "I needed the bathroom," Johnny stammered, shaking. "I saw something." Mr. Garrett's face darkened. He glanced toward the trees, then back at Johnny. "The bathroom's over there. Go! Now!" Johnny stumbled off, his legs barely carrying him. When he returned to the cabin, he crawled into his bunk and cried silently until exhaustion finally took him. The next morning, breakfast was lively, but Johnny sat alone, poking at his food. Another boy, Aaron, plopped down beside him. "Hey, man. You okay? You look like you saw a ghost," Aaron said with a grin. Johnny didn't look up. "Just leave me alone," he muttered. "Come on, I'm just trying to help," Aaron replied. "Name's Aaron, by the way. If you want to talk, I'm around." Johnny nodded faintly but said nothing. That night, as the camp settled into silence, Johnny and Aaron decided to investigate. Bundled in thin pajamas, they crept outside, their breath visible in the icy air. "What are we even looking for?" Aaron whispered. "That thing," Johnny said. "I need to know it's real." As they moved deeper into the camp, the boys heard a door creak behind them. They turned just in time to see Mr. Garrett step into the clearing, his flashlight scanning the area. "Run!" Johnny hissed, and the two bolted toward a nearby building. They ducked inside, locking the door behind them. Inside was a small room lined with dusty computer monitors. On the screens, they saw grainy footage of the campgrounds. Most cameras showed nothing useful, just dirt or empty cabins. But one screen made Johnny's blood run cold. There on the feed were two massive, pale feet. The same feet he had seen the night before. Johnny stared, his breath hitching. "It's here," he whispered. The pale feet on the screen shifted suddenly, moving out of frame with unnerving speed. Johnny and Aaron exchanged alarmed glances, their breath hitching. The creature wasn't just roaming, it was on the move, and quickly. Fear gripped the boys, not just because this unknown thing was prowling the same camp where they were stuck for months, but because they had no idea where it was headed. The scattered, unhelpful camera angles provided no clues. For all they knew, the creature could be closing in on them. The boys stayed frozen in their makeshift hideout, eyes glued to the monitors, hoping to spot either the creature or Mr. Garrett on one of the feeds. Time passed slowly, and fatigue began to weigh on them. As their eyelids drooped, they were jolted awake by the explosive sound of a gunshot echoing through the night, startling them upright. "Did you hear that?" Aaron whispered, wide-eyed. Johnny nodded and pointed at one of the monitors. On the screen, they saw Mr. Garrett standing near the gate, holding a smoking handgun. His chest heaved as he caught his breath. Moments later, another chilling sound reached them, a guttural, pained scream that sent shivers down their spines. It had to be the creature. The camera's audio was too faint to pick up much else, but the heavy thudding of footsteps soon followed, rapid and retreating. Whatever Mr. Garrett had done, it had driven the creature away. The boys stared at the screen, stunned. "He actually shot it," Aaron said, barely above a whisper. Johnny nodded slowly. "Yeah, but I don't think that thing's gone for good." As they watched, Mr. Garrett turned and began walking back toward the cabins, his movements deliberate and heavy. Johnny glanced at Aaron. "We should wait a while before we head back. No way he's sleeping after something like that," he said. Aaron raised an eyebrow. "Wait a while. He just shot a monster. The guy's probably wired. I doubt he'll even close his eyes tonight. Johnny sighed, glancing around the small room they had holed up in. Fine. Looks like we're staying here. The next morning, Johnny and Aaron woke abruptly to the piercing sound of a siren blaring from the loudspeaker in the camp center. The noise was so loud it felt like the walls of their shelter were vibrating. Groggy and still dressed in their thin pajamas, the boys stumbled outside into the cold morning air. Where is everyone? Johnny asked, squinting at the eerily quiet camp. Aaron shrugged. Let's head back to the cabin, he said, shouting over the relentless wail of the siren. Johnny nodded, and they shuffled toward their bunkhouse. When they arrived, the cabin was empty. There was no sign of the other boys or Mr. Garrett. The deafening sound of the siren only added to the strange tension in the air. We've got to turn that thing off, Aaron yelled, his hands clamped over his ears. Yeah, no kidding, Johnny shouted back. The two stepped back outside, scanning the camp for any clue about where the siren controls might be. It has to be in one of those buildings, Aaron hollered. He gestured toward the structures lining the camp's perimeter. I'll check to the left, you check to the right. If we don't find it, we'll meet under the loudspeaker. Johnny gave a thumbs up and headed toward his assigned side of the camp. They spent the next 10 minutes scouring the cabins and sheds, their ears ringing painfully from the unrelenting noise. Finally, the siren stopped. Johnny sighed in relief, slumping against a wall. Thank God, he muttered to himself. On the other side of the camp, Aaron also relaxed, but as he moved his hand from his ear, he noticed fresh blood streaking down his fingers. His eardrum had ruptured. Aaron stared at the crimson streak in disbelief, shaking slightly. He stumbled out of the building and called for Johnny, his own voice muffled by his injury. Johnny! He yelled, though the sound felt distant even to himself. Johnny saw Aaron approaching but couldn't make out what he was saying. The boys met in the clearing, their faces pale and strained. For a while, they just stood there, staring at each other, unable to communicate over the ringing in their ears. Finally, Johnny motioned toward a nearby cabin, and Aaron followed without a word. Inside, the two boys sat on the wooden floor, trying to regain their senses. Blood from their ears pooled on the floorboards, stark against the dusty wood. You okay? Johnny asked hesitantly, his voice still faint in his own ears. Aaron nodded. I'll live. My head just feels like it's been hit by a truck. What do you think happened to everyone else? Johnny asked after a pause. Aaron shrugged. Beats me. Maybe they all left. Maybe something else happened. His voice trailed off, and neither boy was eager to finish the thought. 30 hours later. The camp had grown silent again, the earlier chaos replaced by an uneasy stillness. Johnny shook Aaron awake in the middle of the night, his face tense. Dude, wake up! I heard something, Johnny whispered. Aaron groaned, rubbing his eyes. What time is it? I don't know, but it sounded like footsteps, Johnny said. Could be the others coming back. The boys stepped outside cautiously, the crunch of snow under their feet the only sound in the darkness. They scanned the camp, their breath visible in the cold air. Suddenly, Aaron stiffened and pointed ahead. There, he stammered, his voice trembling. It's tall. Johnny turned to look, his heart sinking as he saw it, the creature. Its pale form stood out against the dark trees, its gangly arms hanging at its sides. Clutched in one hand was a bloodied hat. At its feet lay the lifeless body of Mr. Garrett, torn in two. Johnny felt bile rise in his throat as he took in the scene. The creature stared at them, its eyeless face somehow locking them in place. Then it opened its mouth and let out a familiar, ear-splitting shriek. Before the boys could react, a figure emerged from the shadows, a bloodied boy limping toward the creature with an unreadable expression. "I'm sorry," the boy whispered, tears streaming down his face. The creature reached out, wrapping its grotesque fingers around the boy and crushing him without hesitation. "We need to go," Aaron whispered, tugging at Johnny's sleeve. "Yeah," Johnny agreed, his voice shaky. The two boys turned and bolted, leaving the nightmare of Leafwood behind.